Sometimes the people who change your life never ask for your name. At exactly 11:47 p.m., a quiet knock echoed across the weathered front porch of Ethan Carter's small farmhouse on the edge of Ashford, Montana. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. Yet somehow it carried the kind of weight that made the night itself seem to stop breathing. Ethan looked up from the old kitchen table where unpaid bills, a half-finished cup of coffee, and his daughter's fourth-grade science project were spread beneath the warm glow of a single hanging light. His 9-year-old daughter, Lily, had fallen asleep on the couch hours earlier with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a golden retriever resting faithfully at her feet. Outside, the cool autumn wind whispered through towering pine trees while dry leaves danced across the gravel driveway. Another knock came, calm and deliberate. Ethan frowned. Nobody visited this far outside town after dark. He quietly stood, pulled on his faded flannel jacket, and walked toward the front door. Before reaching it, he glanced through the small living room window. His breath caught for just a moment. Parked outside his modest home were 3 black luxury SUVs reflecting the pale moonlight like polished mirrors. Their engines idled silently. Men in tailored suits stood respectfully near the vehicles without saying a word. At the center of the driveway stood a woman unlike anyone Ethan had ever expected to see outside his front door. She appeared to be in her early 30s, wearing a long camel-colored coat over a navy dress, her blonde hair gently moving with the Montana breeze. She carried no purse, no briefcase, only a quiet expression that somehow balanced confidence with uncertainty. She wasn't smiling, but neither did she seem cold. She simply waited. Ethan opened the door halfway. "Can I help you?" he asked politely. The woman studied his face for a long second before speaking. "Are you Ethan Carter?" Her voice was calm, measured, unmistakably refined. Ethan nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." She lowered her eyes briefly, as though collecting thoughts she had rehearsed 100 times, but suddenly couldn't remember. Then she looked back at him. "Did you repair an elderly woman's Buick this afternoon, about 20 miles west of town?" Ethan blinked, surprised by the question. Images from earlier that day flashed across his mind. A lonely stretch of highway, steam rising from beneath an old Buick's hood, an elderly woman insisting she was perfectly fine while struggling to tighten a radiator hose with trembling hands. Ethan had simply done what anyone should have done, or at least what he believed anyone should have done. He smiled faintly. "Yes, I did." The woman inhaled slowly. For the first time, the confidence in her eyes softened into something deeply personal. "She was my grandmother." Silence settled between them. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ethan had no idea that the simple act of tightening a loose hose, refusing payment, and wishing an elderly stranger a safe drive home had quietly set something extraordinary into motion. And before another minute passed, the woman standing beneath the porch light was about to tell him a truth that would change all 3 of their lives forever. The woman offered a small, respectful nod before speaking again. "My name is Victoria Harrington." Ethan recognized the name immediately. Almost everyone in Montana did. Harrington Industries had built hospitals, funded schools, restored historic towns, and employed thousands across the country. He glanced toward the line of black vehicles and then back at the woman standing beneath his porch light. She did not carry herself like the powerful executive he had seen in newspapers. Tonight, she looked more like a granddaughter carrying the weight of gratitude. "My grandmother told me exactly what happened," Victoria said quietly. She said her car overheated on Highway 47. Several vehicles drove past without stopping. "You were the only one who pulled over." Ethan shrugged gently. "She needed help. That was all." Victoria studied him carefully, almost searching for something hidden beneath the simplicity of his answer. "She also said you spent nearly an hour fixing the radiator, replaced a cracked hose with one from your own truck, and refused every dollar she tried to give you." Ethan smiled with quiet embarrassment. The replacement hose was sitting in my toolbox anyway. It fit her car better than mine. I could buy another one next week. Victoria lowered her eyes for a brief moment. It was such an ordinary sentence, spoken without pride or expectation, that had unsettled something inside her. She had spent years negotiating billion-dollar contracts where every favor carried a price and every promise demanded leverage. Yet this man had quietly given away both his time and his own equipment to a stranger he would probably never meet again. From inside the house came the soft creak of the old couch. Little footsteps padded across the wooden floor. Lily appeared in the hallway wearing oversized pajamas, rubbing one sleepy eye. "Daddy," she whispered. Ethan turned immediately, his voice warm. "Everything is all right, sweetheart. Go back to bed." Lily noticed the elegant woman standing outside. "Oh," she said softly. "Did somebody's car break again?" Ethan laughed under his breath. "Not tonight." Victoria smiled for the first time since arriving. It was small but genuine. Lily looked at her curiously before whispering, "Grandma always said Daddy cannot walk past someone who needs help. That is why we are always late." Ethan chuckled and shook his head. "I think your bedtime is definitely late enough." Lily grinned, waved politely at Victoria, and disappeared back toward the living room where the golden retriever lifted his head briefly before settling down again. The simple exchange lingered in the cool night air. Victoria could not remember the last time she had stood on a front porch where nothing felt rehearsed. No assistants waited with schedules. No reporters hid behind cameras. No one was trying to impress anyone else. She reached into her coat pocket and carefully removed a white envelope. "My grandmother asked me to bring this." Ethan did not take it. "What is it?" "Something she believes you earned." Ethan slowly shook his head before she could continue. "If it is money, I cannot accept it." Victoria looked at him with quiet surprise. "You have not even opened it." Ethan smiled gently. "I do not need to. I helped your grandmother because she reminded me of someone who once helped my family when we had nothing. If I put a price on kindness now, I will be paying back the wrong person." For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The porch light cast a warm circle around the old wooden steps while distant crickets filled the silence. Victoria finally lowered the envelope. Somewhere deep inside her, a belief she had carried for years began to crack, not with noise, but with the quiet certainty that perhaps the rarest kind of wealth had never belonged inside a bank account at all. Victoria slipped the unopened envelope back into her coat pocket without another word. For the first time in years, she realized she had arrived prepared to solve gratitude with money, only to discover that money had never been the language spoken on this quiet porch. The silence between them felt strangely comfortable, interrupted only by the distant chirping of crickets and the gentle rustle of pine branches beneath a sky crowded with stars. Finally, Victoria spoke again, her voice softer than before. "My grandmother asked me to tell you something else." Ethan leaned lightly against the wooden porch railing. "What was that?" "Victoria smiled fondly. She said you reminded her of my grandfather." Ethan looked surprised. "That is quite a compliment." Victoria nodded slowly. He owned nothing when they met. Just a pickup truck, a toolbox, and the habit of stopping whenever someone needed help. Ethan chuckled quietly. "Sounds like a good man." "He was," Victoria answered. "He built everything our family has today, but he always told us that character comes long before success. Somewhere along the way, I think I forgot that." The words lingered in the cool night air. Ethan did not rush to answer. He had learned years ago that some conversations needed room to breathe. Behind him, the old farmhouse settled with its familiar wooden creaks, the kind that only homes filled with memories seem to make. Victoria glanced toward the weathered garage standing beside the house. The faded white paint had begun to peel. A hand-painted sign above the wide doors, "Simply Reed Carter Auto Repair." One light still glowed through the dusty window. "You work this late every day?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "Only when customers need their cars before morning. Around here, people cannot always wait until next week." "And your daughter?" "She usually insists on helping until she falls asleep sitting on a stool." Victoria looked toward the living room window, where Lily's blanket was just visible beneath the warm light. "She seems like a wonderful little girl." Ethan's eyes softened immediately. "She makes every long day worth it." There was no hesitation in his answer, no dramatic speech, only the quiet certainty of a father who had built his entire life around a single promise. Victoria noticed it instantly. She had attended leadership conferences around the world where people delivered polished speeches about priorities and purpose, yet none of those words carried the simple honesty contained in that one sentence. Her phone vibrated gently inside her coat pocket. She glanced at the screen. 7 missed calls from members of her executive team. 2 urgent messages marked for immediate response. Without reading either one, she silenced the phone and slipped it away again. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. "Do you ever take a day off?" Victoria asked with an almost playful smile. Ethan laughed quietly. "My daughter says Sunday afternoons count if I stop answering the garage phone." Victoria laughed with him, the sound surprising even herself. It had been months since she had laughed without calculating who was listening. As the moments settled, headlights appeared at the far end of the gravel road. An older Buick rolled slowly into the driveway before coming to a gentle stop beside the porch. The driver's door opened, and the elderly woman stepped out wearing the same knitted blue sweater she had worn that afternoon. She smiled the moment she saw Ethan. "I knew I would find you both still talking," she said warmly. Ethan's face brightened with genuine surprise. "Ma'am, you should be home resting." She waved away the concern with quiet confidence. "Some conversations are too important to leave until tomorrow." Victoria looked from her grandmother to Ethan, sensing that the evening she believed was ending had only just begun. The elderly woman climbed the porch steps without waiting for anyone to offer a hand, her gentle smile carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime recognizing goodness when she saw it. Ethan opened the screen door wider. "Please come in. It is getting colder out here." She looked toward Victoria with affectionate eyes. "You see, a kind heart always notices the weather before it notices itself." Inside the farmhouse, the scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon lingered in the warm air. The old wooden floor creaked softly beneath their footsteps while a grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, measuring the night with peaceful certainty. Lily peeked around the hallway again, curiosity overcoming sleep. The elderly woman smiled immediately. "You must be Lily." The little girl nodded shyly. "Daddy says it is not polite to stare." The woman laughed quietly. "Then your father has already taught you more than most boardrooms ever learn." Victoria could not help smiling. She had attended countless executive meetings where intelligence filled the room, but kindness often did not. Ethan poured 3 cups of coffee and a mug of warm milk for Lily before everyone settled around the worn oak kitchen table. The furniture was old, polished smooth by decades of family dinners and ordinary conversations. Nothing matched perfectly, yet everything belonged. The elderly woman wrapped both hands around her coffee cup before looking directly at Ethan. "There is something I should tell you." Ethan simply nodded. "I am listening." She glanced toward Victoria. This afternoon was not entirely an accident. Ethan looked puzzled, but remained calm. "I have been driving that old Buick through several small towns over the past 2 weeks." Victoria turned toward her grandmother with surprise. "You never told me that." "Because you would have stopped me," the older woman replied gently. "I wanted to see whether people still stopped for strangers when there was nothing to gain." Ethan remained silent. "Most drivers never slow down," she continued. Some looked away. Others smiled politely before continuing down the road. A few even suggested I call roadside assistance without rolling down their windows. Her eyes settled warmly on Ethan. "You were different. You never asked who I was. You never asked whether I could afford the repair. You only asked whether I was safe." The room grew still. Even the steady ticking of the clock somehow sounded softer. Victoria lowered her eyes, remembering countless presentations about customer value, leadership, and corporate responsibility. None of them had described compassion as simply as the man sitting across the table had lived it. The elderly woman reached into her handbag and carefully placed a faded black and white photograph on the table. It showed a young mechanic standing beside an old pickup truck with grease on his hands and a wide smile across his face. Beside him stood a young woman laughing, as if the entire world belonged to them. "That is my husband," she said quietly. "The day we opened our first repair shop." Ethan studied the photograph carefully. He looks proud. He was proud, she answered. Not because he dreamed of becoming wealthy, but because he believed every honest repair was a promise kept. Victoria stared at the photograph longer than anyone else. She had walked past framed portraits of her grandfather inside company headquarters hundreds of times. Yet somehow this worn photograph carried more truth than every polished painting hanging on those walls. Her grandmother gently folded her hands together and looked back at Ethan. Tonight, I did not come here to reward your kindness. I came because I believe my granddaughter has forgotten what built our family in the first place. And somehow, without realizing it, you reminded her. The old photograph remained on the table long after no one was looking directly at it, as though it had become another guest in the room. Ethan carefully slid it back toward the elderly woman with both hands. Thank you for sharing that with me, he said quietly. Your husband must have been an honorable man. She smiled with gentle pride. He believed that every person deserved the same respect, whether they drove a brand new luxury car or an old truck held together by hope. Ethan nodded. Then I think I would have liked him. Victoria watched the exchange without speaking. She had spent years surrounded by people who admired her grandfather's achievements. But tonight was the first time she had heard someone admire the man instead of the fortune he eventually created. A warm silence settled over the kitchen until Lily wandered back into the room carrying a small shoebox decorated with faded stickers. Daddy, she said softly, can I show them? Ethan smiled. Only if you want to. Lily placed the box on the table and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of handwritten thank you notes, homemade greeting cards, and small photographs from neighbors around Ashford. One card had been drawn in bright crayons by a little boy. Another was written on lined notebook paper by an elderly couple. Victoria looked at them curiously. What are these? Lily answered before her father could speak. People leave them after Daddy fixes their cars when they cannot pay everything right away. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck with quiet embarrassment. Some folks insist on saying thank you somehow. Lily picked up one of the folded notes and read it with innocent pride. Thank you for staying after closing so I could drive my wife to her cancer treatment. We will never forget your kindness. She reached for another. Thank you for fixing my brakes before the snowstorm. You refused extra money because you said Christmas was expensive enough. Victoria looked from one card to another. None mentioned discounts or invoices. Every single one talked about dignity, patience, or hope. The collection was worth nothing at an auction, and yet somehow felt more valuable than many awards displayed inside corporate headquarters. The elderly woman noticed Victoria's expression and smiled knowingly. These are the dividends of a generous life. Ethan quietly closed a shoebox. Most people around here have helped us too. When Lily was younger and I had to work late, neighbors brought dinner. When our roof leaked, 3 families showed up with ladders before I even asked. I did not build this life alone. Victoria listened carefully. She realized he never described kindness as a personal achievement. He always spoke as though goodness naturally belonged to everyone willing to pass it along. Her phone vibrated again. This time she glanced at the screen before setting it face down on the table without answering. Her grandmother noticed the gesture. Important. Victoria exhaled slowly. Tomorrow morning the board will vote on closing our smallest manufacturing plant. Nearly 300 people could lose their jobs. Ethan remained quiet, allowing her to continue. On paper, it is the logical decision. She looked around the modest kitchen where every object carried signs of honest use instead of luxury. But tonight, I'm beginning to wonder whether numbers always tell the whole story. Ethan folded his hands calmly on the table. Sometimes the easiest thing to measure is not the most important thing to protect. No one responded immediately. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm while the porch light cast a warm glow across the window. Victoria had arrived believing she was there to thank a stranger. Instead, with every passing minute, she found herself questioning the very principles that had guided her entire career. When the old grandfather clock finally chimed midnight, no one seemed eager to leave. The warmth inside the farmhouse had quietly dissolved the invisible distance that had separated their worlds only an hour earlier. Victoria rose from her chair and walked toward the kitchen window. Outside, the line of black sport utility vehicles remained parked beneath the porch light, their polished surfaces reflecting a home that could not have been more different from the glass towers where she normally spent her days. She looked back at Ethan. "Would you do something for me tomorrow?" Ethan smiled politely. "That depends on what you are asking." Victoria hesitated, almost surprised by her own request. "Come to my headquarters. I would like you to see something." Ethan let out a quiet laugh. "I am afraid tomorrow is already full. Mrs. Dawson needs new brakes before noon. A rancher is bringing in an old pickup with transmission trouble, and I promised Lily we would finish her science project after school." Victoria blinked, then smiled. She had expected scheduling conflicts, but not ones that sounded so wonderfully ordinary. "You are turning down the invitation of a chief executive officer." Ethan shrugged gently. "I am keeping promises I made before yours." His answer carried no disrespect, only quiet honesty. The elderly woman watched her granddaughter with a knowing expression. "Character has a calendar of its own," she said softly. Victoria laughed under her breath. "I suppose it does." Lily wandered back into the kitchen, carrying a notebook covered with colorful drawings. "Daddy, I almost forgot." She handed it to him before looking at Victoria. "Tomorrow is career day at school." Ethan opened the notebook and smiled. "That is right." Lily looked hopefully between the two adults. "My teacher says parents should talk about what they do for work." Ethan gently scratched his chin. "I was planning to explain how engines work." Lily tilted her head. "But everybody already knows you fix cars." She turned toward Victoria with innocent curiosity. "Do you think people would like hearing about running a company?" Victoria looked genuinely surprised. "You would want me to come?" Lily nodded without hesitation. "You seem nice now." The room burst into soft laughter, including Victoria's. It was the kind of honest observation only a child could make without embarrassment. Victoria smiled warmly at Lily. "I would be honored if your teacher would allow it." Ethan looked at his daughter, then at Victoria. "That would certainly make career day unforgettable." Victoria reached into her coat and removed a simple business card, placing it on the kitchen table rather than handing it directly to Ethan. "Here is my direct number. No assistance. No switchboard. If you ever need anything, you call me yourself." Ethan looked at the card but made no move to pick it up immediately. "Thank you." The elderly woman slowly stood, gathering her handbag. "It is time we let this family get some sleep." Victoria nodded, though part of her seemed reluctant to leave. As they stepped onto the porch, the cold Montana air wrapped around them once again. Ethan walked them to the top step while the porch light cast long shadows across the gravel driveway. Just before reaching her vehicle, Victoria paused and turned back. "Tomorrow morning, I will walk into a board meeting with hundreds of pages of financial reports." She looked directly at Ethan. "But somehow I think the most important lesson I learned this week came from a garage, a kitchen table, and a little girl who believes keeping your word matters more than impressing important people." Ethan simply smiled. "Safe drive home." She nodded gratefully before climbing into the waiting vehicle. As the convoy disappeared into the quiet darkness, none of them noticed that a local newspaper photographer, returning from an assignment on the nearby highway, had paused just long enough to capture a single photograph of the elegant executive standing beneath the weathered porch light beside the humble mechanic. By sunrise, that unexpected image would begin a conversation that none of them had seen coming. By 7 o'clock the next morning, the quiet photograph had traveled farther than anyone expected. The front page of the Ashford Gazette carried a simple headline above the image of Victoria standing beneath Ethan's weathered porch light. It read, "Unexpected visit brings small town and big business together." The article did not speculate. It merely described what neighbors had witnessed: a convoy of black sport utility vehicles outside a modest farmhouse, and a chief executive officer who spent nearly 2 hours inside without cameras, speeches, or publicity. Still, curiosity spread quickly. At Carter Auto Repair, Ethan unlocked the garage as he always did, rolled up the wide metal door, and switched on the fluorescent lights that buzzed softly above the service bays. The familiar scent of motor oil and fresh coffee welcomed another ordinary morning. He had not seen the newspaper. He had no idea that customers arriving for routine maintenance were carrying copies folded beneath their arms. Mrs. Dawson was the first to arrive with her aging station wagon. As Ethan inspected the brake system, she smiled warmly. "Looks like you have important friends now." Ethan looked up with genuine confusion. "Ido." She handed him the newspaper. Ethan studied the photograph for several quiet seconds before smiling to himself. That photographer certainly found the right place at the right time. Mrs. Dawson laughed. Most people would be calling every reporter they know. Ethan returned the paper. "I have brake pads to replace before lunch." Word continued spreading throughout the morning. Some customers asked respectful questions. Others simply smiled without saying anything at all. Every conversation ended the same way. Ethan changed oil, replaced worn belts, tightened loose bolts, and thanked each customer exactly as he had the day before. Nothing about his routine changed because someone important had visited his home. Nearly 100 miles away, the atmosphere inside Harrington Industries headquarters could not have been more different. Executives gathered around a polished conference table overlooking downtown Billings. Financial reports covered every seat. Coffee cups sat untouched as quiet conversations filled the room. Several board members had already seen the newspaper. One director adjusted his glasses before sliding the article across the table toward Victoria. "Would you care to explain this?" he asked politely. Victoria glanced at the photograph without embarrassment. "There is nothing mysterious to explain." Another executive leaned forward. "The market has already begun asking questions." Victoria folded the newspaper carefully before placing it beside her agenda. Then perhaps the market should hear the truth. The room fell silent. She stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "Yesterday, my grandmother's car broke down on a rural highway. A mechanic stopped to help her. He refused payment. He used his own parts to complete the repair. He expected nothing in return." She turned to face the board. "Last night, I thanked him." One director gave a polite nod. "That is admirable. But why spend 2 hours there?" Victoria answered without hesitation. "Because I remembered what leadership looked like before quarterly reports replaced character as our first priority." Several members exchanged uncertain glances. No one argued, yet no one seemed entirely comfortable either. At that same moment, far from polished conference rooms and financial projections, Ethan stood beside Lily in her elementary school cafeteria, helping her carry a cardboard model of the solar system for career day. He smiled as she carefully balanced the painted planets. Neither father nor daughter realized that while they prepared for an ordinary afternoon at school, decisions being made inside a distant boardroom were slowly pulling their quiet lives toward a future none of them could yet imagine. The applause inside Lily's elementary school cafeteria faded into cheerful conversations as students gathered around their parents, proudly introducing them to classmates and teachers. Ethan answered questions about engines with the same patience he showed every customer at his garage, explaining how even the smallest bolt had an important job if people wanted to travel safely. The children listened with wide eyes, fascinated by greasy tools and simple lessons about responsibility. Just as the presentations were ending, the school principal stepped quietly into the room and smiled at Ethan. "There is someone here asking for you." Ethan turned toward the entrance. Victoria stood just inside the doorway, wearing a simple navy blazer instead of the formal business suits she usually wore in board meetings. She carried no security team, no cameras, and no sense of ceremony. Only a notebook rested in her hands. Lily's face immediately brightened. "You came," she exclaimed as she hurried over. "Victoria smiled warmly. I promised I would try." The teacher welcomed her without hesitation, inviting her to say a few words about leadership. Victoria looked around the classroom before speaking. "When I was your age, I believed success meant becoming the smartest person in every room. As I grew older, I thought success meant leading the biggest company I could build. This week, someone reminded me that real success begins much earlier. It begins with how you treat people who cannot give you anything in return." The room grew remarkably quiet. Parents who had been gathering their belongings stopped to listen. Teachers exchanged thoughtful glances. Victoria continued with calm sincerity. Yesterday, I met someone who never asked what another person owned before offering help. That lesson is worth more than every business textbook I have ever read. She looked toward Ethan with genuine gratitude before returning her attention to the children. Never underestimate ordinary kindness. It has a way of reaching places you cannot imagine. As the presentation ended, several parents approached Ethan to thank him for raising such a thoughtful daughter. Others congratulated Victoria on her heartfelt remarks. Neither of them seemed interested in the unexpected attention. They simply stood together while Lily excitedly explained her solar system project to anyone willing to listen. Later that afternoon, Victoria returned to headquarters for the continuation of the board meeting. This time the atmosphere felt different. Instead of opening another financial report, she placed Lily's carefully painted cardboard planet Earth at the center of the conference table. Several executives looked puzzled. Victoria smiled gently. A fourth grader reminded me today that every decision affects real families, not just spreadsheets. She paused before continuing. I have reviewed every recommendation concerning the Ashford manufacturing plant. Closing it may improve this quarter's numbers, but keeping it open protects 300 families who have spent decades helping build this company. One board member quietly asked, "What changed your mind?" Victoria answered without looking away. "I finally remembered what this company was created to do. Profit keeps a business alive. Character gives it a reason to exist." The room remained silent for several long moments before one director slowly folded his report and set it aside. Another followed, then another. The discussion that came next sounded nothing like the meeting scheduled on the agenda that morning. Ideas replaced objections. Solutions replaced assumptions. By the end of the afternoon, the vote was unanimous. The Ashford plant would remain open while a new modernization plan was developed instead of eliminating jobs. As employees across the company began receiving the unexpected announcement, Ethan was back. Inside his garage replacing a worn water pump on an old pickup truck, completely unaware that a quiet conversation around his kitchen table had just changed the future of hundreds of families he would probably never meet. 3 mornings later, the first rays of sunlight slipped across the gravel driveway as Ethan rolled open the garage door just as he had done thousands of times before. The familiar sound echoed across the quiet Montana fields while birds welcomed another ordinary day. He reached for his toolbox, expecting nothing more than oil changes, worn tires, and neighbors stopping by for coffee before work. Instead, he found an old blue Buick parked neatly beside the garage. The elderly woman sat behind the wheel with the window rolled down, smiling exactly as she had the afternoon they first met. Beside her stood Victoria, dressed in blue jeans, a light sweater, and comfortable boots that looked more suited for a small town than a corporate office. There were no black sport utility vehicles, no assistants, no security detail. Only 2 women carrying a cardboard tray of fresh coffee and a paper bag from the local bakery. Ethan laughed softly. I was beginning to think rich people never arrived without a schedule. Victoria smiled. I'm trying something new. Lily came running from the house with the golden retriever close behind. You really came back, she said happily. Victoria handed her a warm cinnamon roll. I promised I would. The 4 of them gathered around the old Buick while the morning air still carried the cool scent of pine trees. The elderly woman rested one hand on the faded hood. She is running better than she has in years, she said proudly. Ethan patted the fender with quiet satisfaction. She just needed someone willing to listen before replacing everything. Victoria looked thoughtfully at the old car before quietly replying, I think people are often the same way. Ethan smiled without answering. Some truths did not need to be explained twice. After breakfast, Victoria reached into the trunk of the Buick and carried out a small wooden plaque wrapped in brown paper. She handed it to Ethan. This is not an award for my company. Ethan carefully unwrapped it. Burned into the polished oak were only a few simple words. Integrity keeps the engine running. Beneath the message, in smaller letters, appeared the name of Victoria's grandfather and the year he opened his first repair shop. Ethan looked at the plaque for a long moment before quietly saying, This belongs with your family. The elderly woman gently shook her head. It always did. We just did not know where to find it until now. Ethan carefully hung the plaque above the entrance to his garage. It fit the weathered building as though it had been waiting there for decades. Customers began arriving one by one, greeting everyone with warm smiles. Some recognized Victoria from the newspaper. Others simply welcomed another visitor to town. Nobody asked for photographs. Nobody treated the moment like a spectacle. It felt surprisingly ordinary, and perhaps that was what made it unforgettable. Before leaving, Victoria paused beside Ethan. "You changed my company without ever walking into my office." Ethan chuckled quietly. "I never changed your company." He looked toward Lily laughing beside the old Buick with her grandmother. "You remembered what was already there." Victoria followed his gaze and nodded slowly. She finally understood that lasting change rarely arrived through dramatic speeches or expensive strategies. More often, it began with one quiet decision to stop for a stranger, one promise kept without expecting applause, and one ordinary family living with dignity when nobody important was watching. As the blue Buick disappeared down the country road beneath a bright Montana sky, Ethan returned to the pickup truck waiting inside the garage, picked up his wrench, and went back to work exactly as he always had. The world around him had changed in ways he never planned, yet the man himself remained the same. And perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all, because real character does not become extraordinary after recognition. It simply continues doing ordinary good until the rest of the world finally learns to notice.